yeah, I have 3 jobs. He goes, well, you're a father, and then what? And I said, well, I have 4 jobs. So anyway, I'm really happy to see you all here, and I'm really happy to talk to you about this. And I'm also really interested in your perspectives and your questions. This is a process that's been going on a while, as I'll talk about, but that's in the middle. So this is a great point to get help from all of you. So here is, please tell me if I get anything wrong. Okay, but here is Frederic Remington's first oil painting, 1875, so 14, 15, called The Captive Gull. All right, and here's what I thought when I first saw it is, in the 19th century, when Frederic Remington is painting this, when he's going to school, there's a lot of conversation about kind of who Gauls were and who the Romans were. And maybe the Romans are the good guys and maybe the Gauls are the good guys. Maybe the Romans are people. Matthew Arnold, a very famous Victorian thinker, wrote something called On Celtic Literature, and he says, Romans are really good to get trains run on time. Romans are really good to make things work. They really, they build roads and they have taxes and good government. But if you want something beautiful, you get a Gaul. If you want something that's kind of wild and amazing, you get a Gaul. They've got this Celtic blood in them that makes them that way. This is part of 19th century kind of racial identity, right? And so one of the things when England is telling its story as it's colonizing all over the world is they say, well, we're the new Romans, right? We're organized. We have great systems of government. We got very, complicated systems of taxation, all these other things. And so Celtic people, and specifically the ones I study, Irish people would say, okay, well then we're the Gauls, right? So this image of a Gaul in chains is particularly interesting to me, okay? So, Irish settlement roads, geographies of migration routes in our country, okay? One of the things that I love about what I do, and I guess my job, or 1/4 of my job, is as a literary historian. So I'm very interested in facts, I'm very interested in things that happen, I'm very interested in telling as close as I can come to the truth, but I understand that maybe the truth rhymes sometimes. Maybe there are some elements of it that can't be dismissed as coincidences, but happen in very strange ways. So intersections is something I'm always looking out for, right? One of my favorite Irish writers is Samuel Beckett, Nobel Prize winner, lived in Paris. When he was in Paris, he gave my favorite professional wrestler, Andre the Giant, a ride to school every day, because Andre the Giant couldn't fit in the bus. Oscar Wilde is one of my favorite writers of the 19th century, one of the funniest people that ever lived in the English language. And he met, after he got out of prison, with a guy named Michael Davitt, a personal hero of mine, the guy that invented the boycott, the guy that invented passive resistance as a way to make social change. And after they met, Oscar Wilde wrote a poem called The Ballad of Reading Gaol. The poem made its way into Parliament, and within a year, lots of prison reform that Oscar Wilde had advocated for happened. So I'm very interested in these intersections. An intersection here, right? Audrey Munson, Miss Manhattan, most famous model in the world. Dozens and dozens of versions of her all over New York City and all over the world, right? Passed away right here in Ogdensburg in 1996. Right? What are the chances, right? So let's start this story, and there is a bit of autobiography in this. Let's start this story in 1987. Obviously, we're talking about 19th century migration, so the story doesn't begin there, but it does for me. Because that's when, in 6th grade, I do a social science project called Irish Immigration to the United States. And the big feature of it was something I'd been fascinated with all my life. All my life I'd come to Potsdam, come to my family's big house, looked at all the stuff there, especially Irish stuff, and been fascinated by it, and wanted to know more. Wanted to know how my people got there. Got from this little island in the North Atlantic to Potsdam. So I decided to do a little research on it. So in 1987, I did my social science project. I believe, I'm not trying to brag, but I believe I got honorable mention, so pedigree here. In 1990, I was on the football team. I had a coach named Coach Pollock. We had to do weight room. This is going to make sense, by the way. Coach Pollock was from Northern Ireland. He was a Protestant extraction from Northern Ireland. And his job was to kind of watch us all lift weights, and that bored him. So he liked to talk to people, about stuff they were interested in. turns out he'd written a dissertation on the Fenians and the Fenian raids that took place, you know, all over the northern border of the United States. He had a particular theory about it that he shared with me, and then he got ticked off with his advisor at the University of Tennessee, and he left and took a job as a high school teacher and kind of left it unfinished. So there were two things about that story I liked. I liked talking about things I was fascinated with, but also I was interested in the idea of this being kind of an unfinished thing, right? In 1993, I did another research paper, this time on the Fenian raids and North Country Irish immigrants specifically. And while I was researching this paper, I was reminded of this. I had forgotten it, but I found a fax form that my father was visiting his father, my grandfather, and he'd faxed from Clarkson a page from the history of the North Country, of course, which in 1993 I couldn't have gotten any other way, to help me with my research, and I found that fax page when I was prepping for this. So from 1997 to 2012, I was at the University of Notre Dame. I was first a student of Irish Studies, and then I was a teacher and administrator and scholar of it, and I kind of continued along these lines. But then in 2012, we moved here. And saying it now, it kind of makes sense that we moved here, but at the time, it didn't seem like that was even a possible thing. We went up to visit my family, and we're coming back from their camp on Lake Azonia, and my wife said, you know, maybe you'll get a job here, and we can live here someday. And like most stupid husbands who have smarter wives, I said, darling, there's no way that's okay. I applied for 160 jobs, like the chances, right? But it turned out that there was a job at SUNY Canton, and my grandfather was a 1932 graduate of SUNY Canton, and so things worked out very well. And when I moved here, I thought, this is a great, I can continue my scholarship, I can continue this process that had begun in 1987, and I can keep researching and trying to figure out what these stories are, what makes these stories interesting, what makes these stories, you know, particularly powerful. So last year I went and did like a talk at the American Conference for Irish Studies in Kansas City, which I discovered when I was giving the talk is where Frederic Remington was a saloon owner for a while, which I thought was neat. And then, you know, from there I've come here, right? And the hyphen represents that I want to know, the dash represents that I want to know from y'all. So, Irish Settlement Road, what is the story behind that name? And what I did was I kind of said, all right, well, there are Ireland roads and Irish Hill roads and all these other things. But I wanted to focus just on the Irish Settlement Road and see what kind of story there was in being in a county that had so many of the doggone things, right? Part of what Irish Settlement Road told me is that the Irish settlement roads, and of course I drove by two on my way here, right? One in Canton and one outside of here, is that these are where you want the Irish people to be, right? And this was the best picture I could think of that, right? In the 19th century, it's a strong theory of the melting pot, right? You throw everybody in, and you add enough heat, and it turns into America soup, right? But you'll notice from this picture, from Puck, somebody doesn't want to be in the soup, right? That's not just an Irish American or an Irish immigrant, that's a Fenian, okay? That's somebody who belongs to a secret organization that was founded in 1856 with the purpose of turning Ireland from being part of the Kingdom of the Great Britain to being a republic, okay? And he doesn't want to sit down. He has his own flag. He has his own clothes. You may notice a distinct likeness to the Lucky Charms leprechaun. He has his bloody knife. Everyone else is content to get stirred around by America with equal rights, but the Fenian is always asking for more. The mortar of assimilation and the one element that won't mix, won't be mixed in, right? So what does this have to do with Frederic Remington? Well, this is the interesting intersection that I'm kind of talking to you about, right? And what it has to do, as near as I can figure most directly, is that Frederic Remington had a father. And his father had a very interesting life. His father, when the Fenians raided from Ogdensburg, was the customs officer, the collector. And he imprisoned the Fenians until they could be sent from Ogdensburg Ogdensburg and from the entire North Country. So, you know, one of the captive Gauls, and Frederick Remington would have been 9 at this point. I doubt if, you know, this is why I'm a literary historian, right? Is that the emphasis is on the literary. So it's not that there's a direct correlation here, but there's something that rhymes here. There's a pattern that I think is pretty interesting, right? And so there's another element of this too, which I want to talk about more, which is, this is from a press account of the Fenian movement. The press was negative to lukewarm, generally speaking, up here about it. But I was particularly struck by this one for a couple of things, right? It says the new Fenian movement. All right, Fenian is an ancient race of Irish warriors. So these are people in the 19th century, in the very modern 19th century, who are saying that we are, you know, we are drawn from ancient warriors, ancient like, just like that, right? Ancient Celtic warriors who went bare-chested, who painted into battle, who had beautiful souls, who made beautiful things, right? And I was struck by this, the brotherhood on the warpath, exciting as the Fenian brotherhood, exciting as small quarters, 500 men and 100 teams crossing the line near Ogdensburg. And that really, again, struck me that something that connects to our friend Fred, right? Which is this idea of comparing the Fenians to Native Americans, First Nations, right? And having this idea, you know, so on the one side we've got the captive Gaul, this kind of sympathetic figure of a Celtic prisoner. And on the other side we've got this kind of inherently warlike people, these people that cannot be calmed, cannot be settled, that just kind of have to fight kind of constitutionally. Thunder all around. I don't know if you can read it at the top. That's what it says. Right? Oops, sorry. Okay, so this story begins in Canton. This is a beautiful picture of Canton. Canton is kind of the center of where my research is. It goes out in directions from that. It begins in Canton, just like Fred. The only reason I have here is because this just in one picture shows me why I love where I live. The children's librarian dresses up like a cat in a hat and rides a bike around. And then, you know, in thinking about how I do my scholarship, you know, my emphasis, again, the literary, is on stories, right? And so what I want to do here is kind of be as part of my process of always wanting to tell a better story. What animates this story is what I've studied my whole adult life, which is Irish studies. And so here are some lessons that Irish studies has brought to me, and I think that helped me kind of notice things and see things and maybe understand things around here. One is that borders are interesting, how they started, right? Where they were drawn, how they're maintained, whether they're soft borders or hard borders, right? How you cross them, whether it's easier to cross them when it's frozen or not, right? These are all interesting things. And so being here on the Canadian border is an interesting feature that that studying Ireland and studying the border with Northern Ireland really helps inform me. Language issues are complex, right? So we have a lot of languages here, right? The St. Regis Mohawk, all the different names for it, right? Different language, different groups of the language group. We've got Quebec, where here's an Ontario stop sign, here's a Quebec stop sign, right? Another thing we learned from Ireland is migration has long-reaching effects. There are maybe 4.5 million people in Ireland, right? Probably about 40 million people claim Irish ancestry in the United States. 70 million worldwide, right? So, you know, I would imagine I'm not the only person in this room that's here as a result of migration, right? And also can maybe try and better understand ourselves by understanding migrations. Okay? And this, of course, being the interesting migration of loyalists from what became the United States after losing the War of Independence, loyalists going and settling just across the lake from us here. Right? And of course, also the migration that begins in Ogdensburg and then extends out across the upper Midwest. Another thing I learned from Irish studies is the study of conflict is valuable. If we want to try and prevent it in the future, we study it and try and learn more about it, right? It's a helpful tool, right? And so here, we're in a place with a lot of conflicts. We've got Native American colonization, French colonization, right? The French and English War, War of Independence, the Patriot War of 1837-40, the War of Rebellion, St. Albans raid, which is an interesting little thing that I learned about from this, which is Southern raiders coming into the United States, Confederate soldiers coming to the United States from Canada. And then this raid, the one that we're going to kind of talk about, the raids, the Fenian raids. So this is a flag of the Fenian Brotherhood, how they saw themselves. Notice they don't look like they're after anybody's Lucky Charms or anything like that, right? You have America and you have Hibernia in harmony. Hibernia has her harp, right? The American flag is in front of the green Irish flag, right? America's shield is protecting Hibernia. This is what the Fenians wanted to do. These were people that came from, many of them, very, very challenging situations. Michael Davitt, to go back to my hero who, invented the boycott, his first memory was seeing his house knocked down by British soldiers, and then his family was split up by migration. These were people that were damaged by that memory and that wanted to do something about it. That's particularly who the Fenian Brotherhood was attracted to. And so, at least for our purposes in this part of the world, they conducted two raids, 1866 and 1870. Right? And in the 1870 raid, this brand newly built U.S. Custom House, which coincidentally, of course, I drove by on the way here. At first I was sad that the dome's gone, the cupola's gone, but then I thought about all the spots for leaks and everything, like with the North Country, and I made my peace with it, looking at pictures. But I thought it'd be worth having an older picture there, right? That is where Collector Remington, the customs officer, who was in coordination with General Meade, the Civil War general that was charged with kind of rounding up all these Fenians. That was where he held these kind of stragglers who were on their way to supposed invasions, but never made it. In 1870, there were two incursions that are interesting for our purposes. One was in Vermont, and the other one was Trout River, was from Malone. Ogdensburg did have a mass of soldiers. There were, by some reports, 500, some said even 1,000 soldiers in Ogdensburg, but it was a feint. The idea was put a bunch of Irish Americans in green jackets here, ship a bunch of arms here, all that kind of thing, and then this is where the interest will be attracted so that they'll have an easier road to Montreal. Right? That was the military idea. Right? So this guy, Civil War hero, plain dealer founder, all these other things. Frederick Remington's dad was the person charged first with maintaining the gunboat that the United States had sent to try and keep the Fenians off the St. Lawrence River, and then with keeping them until they could be freed. There was a big fear that you got basically a defeated, I don't know what you want to call them, they're veterans, they're all veterans of the Civil War, so they're trained in combat, but they didn't function very well as an army, and they didn't have food, they didn't have supplies. The big concern was that they were going to turn to looting, right? And there would be kind of undefended spots all throughout the North Country, so that was why he was charged with rounding them up. He, of course, had been a captain, and at the end of the Civil War, promoted to major. He's called colonel. I don't know how he got that promotion. I don't know if I figured that one out, but anyway, a war hero, and someone who captured, right? So now let's look at the bigger stuff, right? Let's look at migration, kind of how that operates. This is something that I don't have to show you, but I did have to show my colleagues a year ago, right? St. Lawrence County is very big. There's lots of stuff going on in it, right? So here's the story that I find interesting. What is it about this thing, Irish Settlement Road? Not Ireland Road, not Ireland Hill Road, not Scotch Settlement Road, not Welsh Settlement Road. What does it say, right? So, let's just say, let's take these four. Although we can definitely expand the list. There's one in Tompkins County, there are a couple in Vermont. We can make this bigger if we want to, but let's just take, they all have the same name, right? And if you look at it, they're all about the same distance from the downtowns. And I got this idea to measure this when I was behind an Amish buggy driving from Ogdensburg to Canton. And I thought, oh, I wonder about how long it would take with a horse and buggy to get from Irish Settlement Road in Canton to downtown. And it turns out it's maybe close enough that you could have somebody there first thing for labor, right? Close enough that you could maybe have them home in time for dinner time. But far enough that you don't really have to worry about them any other way, right? You don't have to worry about, say, them going to school with your kids. You don't have to worry about them drinking in the same establishments or eating in the same establishments, right? They're very well contained as a population if they have settlements, right? And of course that idea of settlement has a sense of impermanence to it, right? There's something that's not right, it's not done yet, right? If it's an Ireland road, that makes sense, right? If it's a Wayland Road, O'Brien Road, that makes sense, right? That's a farm that's on that property or somebody that owns those properties. But this idea of settlement, right, that this kind of temporary thing has been around for, based on what I could figure out, 160 years, really interests me. And the idea that kind of the middle point of all these roads makes it very convenient. Of course, Canton, the one Canton is between Canton and Rensselaer Falls, and it's about the same distance in the way. If you want to work in the mills in Rensselaer Falls or Canton, you can go that way. Ogdensburg's the same way with Hubleton, right? These are roads that connect these communities, right? And that people could live on without maybe being completely part of the community, right? And so one of the things to think about is, what did people do when they were here, right? You have all kinds of interesting numbers going, right? But what you have, in Ogdensburg, you have essentially the premier gateway for Irish Americans to get to the upper Midwest, right? So when you see the River Green in Chicago, which they shouldn't do because it's a environmental disaster, but you know what I'm talking about, that's because of Ogdensburg, right? The easiest way to get from Ireland to the United States was through Montreal, okay? The cost of a ticket is about as much as 1/10 of a ticket to New York City, okay? Cheapest place you could go, probably New Orleans, right? 5 times cheaper, quarter cheaper to go to Montreal because they want to promote colonization in their own colonies, right? There's no immigration law, there's no immigration authority, so once you got to Montreal, there's nothing preventing you from crossing over at some point. St. Lawrence River, of course, being the easiest way to do that, right? And then once you cross over, if you want to get anywhere, this is pre-Seaway, obviously, right? You have to go to Ogdensburg. That's where you have to get, you know, if you want to settle, if you want to be part of the St. Paul, Minneapolis Irish, or the Chicago Irish, or the Milwaukee Irish, or any of these other groups, or Cleveland Irish, any of these other groups, the easiest way to get there, cheaper than by rail, quicker than by rail, more efficient than by rail, is by getting on a ship here or very close to here. So what did people do? Well, people had farms, of course. People built trains. Right? Irish logged. Right? That's my grandmother's family. She was born in a logging camp in South Colton. I could look at that picture forever. Right?
Wow.
One thing that strikes me about it, and this doesn't necessarily connect to the talk, but of course, is that the best time to log was the coldest time of the winter. So occasionally when I think about this stuff, when I'm driving around, I think about how unhappy I would be in negative 17 weather, moving these kinds of logs around, right? But that's the easiest way to cut them and the easiest way to get them moving. They basically would create slick streams and then ice slides to put them down so that they could pick them up at the thaw.
Only 2 horses is strange.
I think other horses pulling on them. Oh, the guys climbed, right? But the logs, yeah, I think they just pulled them across, right? They pulled them on the sledge, or maybe those same horses pulled them on the sledge and then they connected them to it. But yeah, I could look at that picture forever, right? So,
Diameter of the trunk.
the thaw, of course, the very dangerous work of bringing the logs to the mill, right? Also mining, right? Disproportionately Irish. I'm afraid I don't remember which North Country mine it is. I have it in my note.
Homer was
Homer,
opposed.
yeah, he's Homer.
Let's go back to Canton.
The other one might have been.
Okay.
Homer was something.
Let's talk about a very particular element of the story of Canton, which is you have Irish Settlement Road. That is the place where that mobile labor force that you could get, say it's a good day to hay, bring a wagon, fill it up with people, bring them in, and then drop them back off, or maybe have them even walk back themselves, and you don't have to worry about them, you don't have to think about them, right? There was a separate school on Irish Settlement Road, right? Everything was separate there. How does that get folded into the village, right? What's the process by which that happens? And how does that happen, of course, in all of these communities, right? How does a population go from being on the periphery, from being on the outside, to being on the inside? And I found some interesting information as I was doing this, right? The first Mass in Canton was on Irish Settlement Road in 1848. It was in a house with a dirt floor, right? Shanty, you guys know that term, right? It's Irish for old house or crummy house, shanty. So it was in a shanty in 1848, right? They brought a priest in, came in through Ogdensburg. It was from Ogdensburg, right? And so it's on Irish Settlement Road, right there on the edge of Canton, where the old map conveniently has it bisected, right? By 1853, the Irish American community in Canton had built St. Mary's Church. 5 years. From a dirt floor to a church building, right? I couldn't find a picture of that. I'd love, Linda, maybe, you know, I couldn't find a picture of the 1853 church. And also, Linda, if you have anything to add, I'm really interested to know. But, of course, that church burned down, not of course, but that church burned down. And one interesting thing to think about going from being the settlements on the periphery, right, 4 miles out by center or whatever, is that the parish of St. Mary's celebrated church in the administrative building, in the county building, right, which was right next door. That's where they celebrated Mass, which is a long way from the dirt floor, of course. And then by 1875, the church that still stands was built, right? So really what you have is, in the space of 27 years, right, a community going from being, you know, migrant labor in a large part, right, displaced by the famine, which means they don't have anything. I could talk, you know, I don't know how I'm doing on time, but I can talk to you about the potato famine for a good 3 hours. But anyway, but coming from extraordinary hardship, right, to being a community that could build something this lasting, that's a really interesting part of this story to me. Right? And what I'm interested in unlocking is as many details as possible to try and make it make sense of how this happened. Right? And that may be something that y'all can share. Right? Here's the entry from the history, right? St. Mary's Church, Roman Catholic, was incorporated August 17, 1874 by Right Reverend Edgar Wadhams, Bishop of the Diocese of Augsburg, Very Reverend James Mackey, Vicar General of said diocese, Reverend James O'Driscoll, pastor of St. Mary's Roman Catholic Church, and layman Dennis Woods and James O'Brien, no relation, as trustees. About 30 years ago, a large number of immigrants from Ireland settled in the western part of the town of Canton on what is now known as the Irish Settlement Road. Right? So, what is it that made that transition happen? Migration is a really important issue that we talk about, seems like pretty much every day in our country, right? And so that's why I'm interested in looking at this story and figuring out, there are, one number, best number in the space of about 2 years, 270,000 Irish people emigrated to Montreal. Okay? 40,000 of them stayed in Canada, somewhere. All the rest of them came to the United States. Right? Again, they might have gone other ways, but one of the easiest, most direct path would have been out of Ogdensburg and into the Great Lakes. Right? And some people, of course, stayed. Right? What is the story of the people that stayed, and what's the story of the people that created a community that's this successful? That's what I'm interested in figuring out. How long did that take?
It is 2:38.
Okay. Anybody have any questions?
I don't have a question, but I will tell you that my maternal great-grandfather, we had a family reunion and they were throwing up slides, and one of them was his naturalization papers, and Ogdensburg was the port of entry,
Mm-hmm.
and he ended up in Indiana.
Yeah. And one thing that I want to say really quickly is, like, Irish studies, there's a lot of people that study it. One of the things, and I didn't, you know, I've learned this from reading all the stuff that people have done here, but this is a really untold story, and it's a really neat one. I'm sorry, I didn't.
Peter O'Shea, who's a retired New York City cop, he has a New York City accent.
Mm-hmm.
When he retired, he moved to Fine, and he's been very active in Adirondack Mountain Club. He leads nature walks at Indian Creek Nature Center. He wrote the hiking guide for this area for Adirondack Mountain Club. He told us at a dinner that the people of his family from Ireland went to Canada first, but then in winter, when the ice was thick on the St. Lawrence River, they crossed into St. Lawrence County with oxen pulling a cart.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, the easiest way to do it, right? Yeah. Which is funny to think about, but yeah, absolutely.
Other people must have come through Montreal also from Europe.
Mm-hmm.
And they came, was Montreal the port of entry?
It
Or
was
was there-
the port of entry. At this point, I'm not an expert on Canadian history, right?
Okay,
The overwhelming numbers were from Ireland. So if we want to do some,
right.
like, you got 8 million people in Ireland at the time. Ireland's still not as big as it was in 1845.
You said that it was the cheapest, fastest way to get from Ireland, or whomever, whatever country they were coming from, through the port probably, and then onward to, you said Indiana, Chicago,
Sure.
whatever?
Mhm. And the reason for that is they're coming from ports of the United Kingdom. They're trying to promote colonization. They don't want to, they want to subsidize the colonization of Canada. They don't want to subsidize the colonization of New York City or Minnesota or anything like that. So it's particular, and the number, there weren't a lot of people super motivated. Well, there weren't as many people super motivated to leave wherever they were in the United Kingdom as Irish people. Because in the space of that 4 years, you got a core of the population either dies or leaves. And that's just them. There continue to be waves of migration after it, but obviously, and think about this particular Irish settlement road, right? The famine is the component of it, right? And so the overwhelming numbers would be from Ireland.
Montreal's the deep water port. That's where they stopped there, and then they got onto smaller boats that take the shallow water and come upstream. They had to go through some rapids, so that may have been part again why they came to Ogdensburg.
Yeah, right.
That way before getting
the
to
seaway,
deep
there's
water
no
again, before you could move on to the Great Lakes.
Exactly.
And also the church was made probably of Potsdam sandstone, and they were involved in the extraction of the Potsdam sandstone.
Yep,
Part of the crews that did that, so that may have been part of why it
That's
was
an
used.
excellent, yeah. That's why my great-great-grandfather moved from the farm in Norfolk to Potsdam, is because of the sandstone industry. So that's a pretty big one for me to have left out. Thank you.
They all had to stop at some island
Grand deal.
and get health
Right.
recommendations and so the graves are there.
Right, there were
On the way.
tremendous problems with disease on the ships on the way over. They got the name coffin ships because of such high mortality rates. And then they would be quarantined rather, just off Montreal. And so these are obviously the people that survived. This is who I'm talking about. But yeah, lots of people didn't.
Well, there was, I don't know the name of the island, but it's from here to Montreal.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's in Washington.
Pardon?
I think there's a cemetery in Washington.
Yeah, no, not in Wellington. This is on the river,
Yeah, off of Washington.
farther up.
Do you know there are immigration records in the county clerk's office?
I did not know that.
Yeah, I'll take you over
Okay.
there. Files,
Looking forward to that.
and they're alphabetically A's, but they're not indexed well there. But there are photos and stories probably of relatives that have come over, so.
Great.
Thanks
That's
for
exactly
that.
what I'm looking for.
And I have a postcard from her husband on the First Church.
Oh, cool. I'm dying to see that.
There are also a number of Scotch settlements,
Mhm.
do they intermingle?
I mean, I don't have
Framed it, and I was sick of it.
I don't have any evidence about that. I would only have rough impressions. It's something of great interest to me, but it's a different, it's an entirely different story than the one that I kind of know. Yeah, but I wonder about it every time, and I think after I finish this, that would be a great thing to
If they
study.
moved on to, say, Chicago area and on, there would have been both,
Sure.
population.
Absolutely. But again, the Irish migration really juked the numbers, right? By dumping 1 million people, most of them in the United States, in the space of 4 years. That's really where you get a kind of migration jumpstart, if that makes sense. Whereas none of the other populations, at least this point that we're talking about here, say the 19th century, none of them have that kind of mass numbers. Right?
You might be interested to know that it was a priest from Ireland that took down that gorgeous steeple on the Catholic Church.
Oh, really? That is interesting.
Rather than repair it.
Uh-huh.
Saved money for the church.
Yeah. That story is not exclusive, unfortunately.
Was that mass migration mostly from Northern Ireland or just the whole country,
No,
basically?
It'd be, I wish I had a map of Ireland here. It'd be from the west.
From the
Okay.
west?
That was the area that was disproportionately poor, that had the poorest farmland, and that was the closest, right? Also, it was the most disproportionately, two things. One is Catholic, which means they're not fully integrated within the United Kingdom, which, you know, at this point has a queen that's also the head of state, and they're different. And also Irish speaking. The majority of the people that came, and the majority of people that would have lived on Irish Settlement Road, wouldn't have been native English speakers. They would have been Irish speakers. Michael Davitt, again, I go back to him. His mother died in Scranton, and she never fully learned English. She died in Scranton in like 1901 or something like that. She could never kind of get it. So yeah, the West was disproportionate. So when you say it's 1 out of 4, in the West of Ireland, there's whole villages that just don't exist anymore because everybody either died or left.
Thinking about South Remington here during this time,
Mhm.
where 1 million in 4 years came through.
Well, 1 million in 4 years to the whole country.
Oh, okay.
Best guess, let's say 200,000.
A lot, a good density of people.
Mhm.
He was customs collector. He was in charge of at least the customs aspect.
Mhm.
Do you know what interface he would have had with this immigration, because customs is goods as
Right.
opposed to people?
I mean, and that's one of the, so I went through, just for this year, 1870, because this is the year that he's dealing with these raids, I was curious at how it affected things for Seth. Can I call him that? Let's see. One thing that I thought was interesting is immediately after the Fenian raids, which I would have thought to be pretty exciting, if an essentially unlimited amount of ammunition landed in Ogdensburg, Malone, Potsdam, if there are, you know, divisions of soldiers in DeKalb Junction, if there are gunboats, and I would be noticing that. Does that make sense? The day after after it's kind of settled or resolved, basically that there's not going to be any more hostility, he's the leader of the Ogdensburg Devotion Day Parade, which is Memorial Day. And they have the parade, like full on, everybody's there. And within a few days, he's meeting in some Republican convention. But what I especially looked at is I looked at his posts as being collective. To see, and one of the things that I'm fascinated by is that they don't care about people. Doesn't make any difference. People come and go across the border, the goods do, and some of the items that he would put auctions would just be amazing. It'd be like 3 bags of tea. And apparently, I guess he was kind of mandated to put it in the newspaper. So it'd be the newspaper, there'd be this legal thing, and he'd say, you know, I confiscated 3 bags of tea. Or I confiscated a pony. You know, this is how it was done legally, this other. And I didn't notice anything that looked, I looked relatively hard. I didn't notice anything that looked like it was disruptive at all. And that, to me, is the most amazing thing, right? Is that he's notified that there's going to be a gunboat here, and he's notified that he's got to deal with these guys. But otherwise, at least as far as kind of the official record goes, there's this huge event, and it doesn't alter him selling his, you know, selling the 5 bottles of rye whiskey. I remember that. Anyway, these other things that were just, he would be posting about monthly. Yeah, I feel like if that happened now, we wouldn't have the Memorial Day Parade quite the same.
John, St. Lawrence County Historical Society in their 2012 edition did a whole story on the Finians.
Mm-hmm.
Did you see that?
Oh yeah, it was one of my sources here. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I read every issue of the St. Lawrence, looked over every issue of the St. Lawrence Historical Quarterly, and then the issues that dealt with either the Remingtons or the or some kind of Irish connection I paid particular attention to, and then also Civil War, which kind of plays in here too.
There was a couple that lived on the Irish Settlement Road. They both passed, but he had ammunition and whatever in his barn from the thing.
I've heard. I'm very curious about that. Yeah.
I'm gonna find out.
Yeah.
from him what
It's I know it's a story that families tell here. I'm very curious about that. It is interesting how, and this goes back I think a little bit to your question, Laura, which is lots of people here, lots of Irish Americans here would not have been big fans of this, right? There were, obviously they had enough community support to, the Ogdensburg auction houses where they stored all their guns, and you know they had enough community support to do this in some ways, but it was not something where there was a groundswell of local support. The people that were in Ogdensburg as this kind of feint maneuver were largely from Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. Most of them were Southern Confederates, although some of them came from New Jersey and New York. Your point underlines one of the things I want to find out most of all, which is what did the people that were here think about it, right?
Thinking of Molly Maguires were probably big here, down in the big coal mining places in Pennsylvania and those places. Were there any secret societies here in that regard? Or?
Well, there clearly are, because there are people who are storing these things, right?
Yeah.
O'Day was the name of the Ogdensburg businessman who was who offered warehousing for the guns and stuff as they came in. So to that extent, they would have been members of the Fenian Brotherhood. William Stevens, whose brother James was the founder, came to Eagle Hall in Ogdensburg the year before on a massive recruiting trip, and so I presume that some number of people took the oath. But again, I don't know. I mean, I could tell you a lot more about people that took the oath in New York City or Boston than I could about people up here, right? And that's why this is fun to study. Any other questions?
Do you know, Sean, if many of the immigrants came here through the port of New York or Boston?
Some did, right? I mean, from what I've been able to figure out, I don't have big notions of patterns. There's no doubt some did, right? There's no doubt some came up from Syracuse, some came directly from New England. You know, all different paths led here for all different reasons, right? But my suspicion is for these, right, these Irish settlement roads, where you've got kind of a pop-up thing, that would have to be relatively quick, rather than the slow, like, I certainly haven't come across any, I mean, the biggest mass movement of Boston Irish here that I'm aware of is the Back to the Land movement in the 1970s. That's when the largest number of Boston Irish move here en masse that I know of, right? Which is to say, people did, but I don't know about it being an organized thing.
There's a cemetery over in Constable, New York, that is a lot of Irish
Mm-hmm.
names, just about all of them. And then there's no population there.
Interesting. I'll look at that. The one exception that makes me think, the one exception is that Brazier Falls did send a number of people to Trout River to, like, a number of people joined the Fenians from Brazier Falls. Which, any other questions?
Thank you.
Thank you all for your time.
Thank you all.